They thought I was dead. My car crushed at the edge of the cliffs in California, my body lost to the rocks below. My brother Donald stood on my grave long before it was dug, stealing my family, my fortune, and my honor. But what he never knew is this: you cannot bury the truth forever, and I have returned. My name is Albert Walker. I am 65 years old, and if you are hearing this voice today, it means I have walked through the fires of betrayal, through the silence of the mountains, and through the shadows of death itself, only to return with a story of love buried deep and hate burning silently within me for years. A story that began long before I was a successful businessman, long before people in California knew my name and respected my work. My story begins in the narrow streets of Fresno, back in the early 1960s, when I was just a boy growing up with my father, my mother, and my little brother Donald. I still remember those dusty afternoons when the sun baked the ground and we, two barefoot brothers, would run through the orchards near our house. Donald was 3 years younger than me, a frail boy with a thin voice and frightened eyes. He was scared of everything: darkness, hunger, even the sound of thunder. Our family was not wealthy. My father, Henry Walker, worked in a small mechanics shop. He used to fix old cars for farmers, and sometimes he came home with grease on his shirt and no money in his pocket. My mother stitched clothes for neighbors to make a little extra. Food was always tight. But whenever there was not enough bread on the table, I would quietly give my share to Donald. I used to watch him eat, his small hands clutching the food, as if the world would snatch it away from him. I would go hungry, but my brother wouldn't know. That was my first lesson in sacrifice, taught not by books but by love. When we walked to school, Jefferson Elementary School in Fresno, it was always me carrying Donald's bag. His bag was heavy for him, but I told him, "Don't worry, brother, I'm strong enough for both of us." He would smile, relieved, while I struggled silently with both my own and his books. During Christmas, when other kids wore new shirts, I made sure Donald got one, even if it meant I went without. I remember one year, 1968, my father couldn't afford 2 shirts. I told my mother to buy one, and I insisted it should be for Donald. His eyes lit up when he wore it, while I stood beside him in my old faded clothes. Nobody noticed my sacrifice, but I didn't care. He was my little brother. Donald. He was not just my brother. He was my responsibility. As we grew older, life tested us harder. By the late 1970s, I had to take small jobs after school, working in grocery stores, cleaning in gas stations, while Donald focused only on his studies. Father was getting weaker. The years of labor were wearing him down. Mother fell sick and passed away in 1978. I was barely 18. That day, I promised myself I would never let my family suffer again. I worked harder than ever. I studied at night, worked by day, and slowly, opportunities began to open. I got a chance to intern in a construction company in Los Angeles. That was the first step into the world that would later know me as a businessman. Donald, meanwhile, went to college with my help. Every dollar I earned, I sent back home. For his books, for his comfort. He was my pride. I even arranged his marriage when the time came. A good family, respectable, wealthy enough. I thought, if he had stability, if he had love, he would never feel the struggles I did. But life, I would learn later, has a cruel way of twisting the very things you give with love. At that time, I was rising. By the 1990s, I was running my own construction firm in San Francisco, Walker Constructions. We built homes, offices, even shopping complexes. My name became known, my face appeared in business magazines. I had a beautiful wife, Clara, and a little daughter, Anna, who was my heartbeat. And of course I had my father, now old and frail, living with us. But Donald, he was never satisfied. Despite everything I gave him, education, marriage, even a place in my company, his eyes always lingered on what I had, not what he had. I thought I saw gratitude in him. I thought I saw love. But maybe, just maybe, I was blinded by my own heart. Looking back now, I realize the signs were always there. His wife, Linda, had a sharp tongue and sharper eyes. She pretended to respect me, pretended to adore Anna, pretended to care for my father. But behind that smile was greed. I ignored my old friend Decale's warnings. Michael had been with me since college, a lawyer by profession, and he once told me, "Albert, your brother and his wife, they're too interested in your wealth. Be careful." I laughed it off. How could I suspect the very brother for whom I had starved as a boy? If only I had listened. The day of betrayal came like any other. I was assigned to oversee a new project site near the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a remote location, dangerous roads carved through the cliffs. I didn't think twice. I left early morning, kissed my daughter goodbye, hugged my father, and drove off in my black sedan. The wind was cold that day. The road was quiet. I remember humming to myself when suddenly, from behind, a large truck rammed into me. The force threw my car against the railing. The metal screamed, the glass shattered, and before I knew it, I was tumbling down the cliff into the darkness below. People later told me my car was found wrecked, twisted like a crushed can. But my body was never recovered. The police searched for days. Divers went into the rivers, but there was no sign of Albert Walker. The world declared me dead. My business, my empire, my family, all of it fell into Donald's hands. But I was alive. Broken, bleeding, unconscious, but alive. When my car went tumbling down the cliff, I thought it was the end. In those final moments of darkness, I whispered Anna's name, my little daughter, my blood, my only light. I whispered Clara's name, my wife, my partner. I whispered Father's name, the man who had given me strength. And then, everything went silent. They say death is cold, but for me, it was strangely warm, like sinking into sleep after a long, exhausting day. But fate was not ready to let Albert Walker go. My eyes opened again, not to the sound of city traffic, not to the comfort of a hospital bed, but to the rough crackling of firewood, to the smell of burning pine, to the distant cry of mountain birds. My body ached everywhere. My head was heavy, and when I tried to move, I realized my leg was bound in cloth and herbs. Someone had saved me. Someone had pulled me out of the jaws of death. That someone was Elias Green, an old man of the mountains. He was 80 years old, his face wrinkled like the bark of ancient trees, his beard long and white, his eyes as sharp as hawks. He lived alone in a wooden cabin high in the Sierra Nevada, where the world forgot its people, but the people never forgot the world. Elias told me he found me lying near the riverbed, broken and half dead when he was collecting herbs. He carried me to his cabin, fed me, treated my wounds with roots and medicines I had never seen before. I didn't speak much those days. My memory was hazy. I couldn't remember my name, my past, or why I had fallen from that cliff. It was as though the mountains had swallowed my history. For weeks, I lived like a ghost in Elias's cabin. He taught me how to breathe again. Every morning he would wake me at dawn, take me outside where the fog still kissed the trees, and make me sit in silence. "Close your eyes," he said, "and listen. The mountain speaks to those who are willing to hear. The river, the trees, the wind, everything has a voice." I thought he was mad, but slowly I began to hear them. I began to feel them. The pain in my bones lessened. The fog in my mind started to lift. Elias was more than a savior. He was a philosopher. He told me stories of the indigenous tribes who once ruled these mountains, how they lived with nature, how they healed not just the body but the soul. He made me drink bitter teas, taught me yoga-like postures, breathing exercises, and slow stretches that gave strength back to my broken body. I chopped wood, fetched water, and cooked with him, like a child learning life all over again. And then, one evening, as the sun bled red across the peaks, it came back. My memory, like a flood breaking through a dam, my past returned. I saw Clara's face, Anna's laughter, Father's frail hands. I saw Donald. Oh God, I saw Donald. His cold eyes, his calculating smile, the moment when that truck rammed into me. I remembered everything. I staggered, I screamed, I fell to the ground. Elias came running. I told him my name, Albert Walker. I told him my story. For the first time in months, I cried like a child, every suppressed memory pouring out in tears and rage. Elias listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. When I was done, when my voice broke into silence, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Now you understand why the mountain kept you alive. You are not done yet. You must return, but not as the man who fell, return as the man who rose." Those words struck me deep. Return. But how? I had nothing. No money, no home, no identity. To the world I was dead. To my family I was a memory. But Elias gave me courage. "You have something stronger than all of that," he said. "You have truth, and truth needs only time to reveal itself." He gave me strength, but I knew I could not fight this war alone. I needed allies. And there was only one man I could trust. My old friend, Michael Carter, the lawyer who once warned me about Donald. I hadn't seen him in years. I didn't even know if he still lived in San Francisco. But Elias had a small radio, and through a local station I learned Michael still practiced law. That night, under the stars, I wrote a letter. I told Michael I was alive, but not to tell anyone yet. I begged him to come to the mountains. Weeks later, a jeep appeared on the rocky path leading to Elias's cabin. Out stepped Michael, older, grayer, but the same determined fire in his eyes. When he saw me, he froze, then rushed forward and hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs would crack again. "Albert, my God, they told us you were dead. Your funeral, your family, and your company, everything." I told him everything. Donald's betrayal, Linda's role, how they threw my father, Clara, and Anna into the countryside like beggars. I told him how my father, the man who once built everything with his hands, was forced to sign over our properties under threats and beatings. Michael's face turned red with anger. "I warned you, Albert. I warned you about them. But don't worry. This time we fight back, and we fight smart." Elias joined us that night by the fire. The three of us, an old mountain sage, a weary businessman, and a loyal lawyer, sat together and planned. Elias said, "Your brother fights with greed, Albert, but you must fight with patience, with wisdom. Let him believe you are still dead. Let him destroy himself while you prepare to return." That was the birth of my second life. The life of vengeance. The life of justice. The night I decided to leave the mountain, my heart beat like a war drum. For months I had lived in the silence of the Sierra, my soul stitched back together by Elias, my body healed by the roots and herbs of the mountain. But now, silence could no longer keep me. The world I had left behind was calling me. Or perhaps it was not the world. It was Clara's eyes, Anna's smile, Father's trembling hands. I had to see them again. I had to know if they were still alive, if they were still breathing under the cruelty of Donald's shadow. I could not appear before them as a ghost, not yet. No, I had to walk the city unseen, to gather truth, to prepare my return. For a man who is thought dead has a weapon no living man possesses. Surprise. Michael agreed to help me. He was more cautious than me. "Albert, listen," he said, his voice stern. "Donald has buried you once. If he knows you're alive, he will bury you again, and this time deeper. We must move carefully. We must strike with evidence, not emotion." I nodded, but deep inside, fire burned hotter than evidence. Yet I knew Michael was right. Emotion blinds, patience sharpens, and Elias's words echoed in me still. Return, not as the man who fell, but as the man who rose. We drove down from the mountain at dawn. The world below looked the same, but I felt like a stranger in my own land. When we reached San Francisco, the streets smelled of gasoline and ambition. I looked at the skyline, the glass towers stabbing the clouds, and thought, this city once knew my name, once bowed to my reputation. Now it does not even know I breathed. Michael arranged a small apartment for me under a false name, Daniel Hayes. It was nothing like my old home, but it was safe. He told me not to leave often, but I could not sit idle. I had to see them. I had to see Clara, Anna, father. So one night, with a cap pulled low and a beard grown wild, I leapt into the dark and made my way toward Redwood Village, the small rural settlement where Donald had banished them. What I saw broke me. There, in a crooked little farmhouse under the dim light of a single bulb, my family lived like outcasts. My father, once proud and strong, now bent and frail, working with his bare hands in the neighbor's field to earn bread. Clara, my elegant wife, who once walked in pearls, now carried buckets of water from the well, her skin rough, her back hunched with labor. And Anna, my sunshine, no longer a child, but a girl on the verge of womanhood, her face tired, her hands blistered, her eyes holding a sadness no child should carry. I stood in the shadows for hours, watching them, my chest tight, my throat burning. Every laugh of Anna, every weary sigh of Clara, every cough of father, it was like knives against my skin. I wanted to run to them, hold them, scream, "I am here, I am alive." But Michael's warning and Elias's wisdom chained me back. Not yet, Albert, not yet. The next day I followed Donald's trail. He had taken my office, my company, my empire. The Walker Enterprises building now bore his name, Trump and Company. He had repainted the lobby, hung his portraits, surrounded himself with men who once bowed to me. When I walked past those glass doors, no one recognized me. I was a ghost in their midst, but I saw everything. The business was flourishing, but not with honor. Donald had turned my company into a machine of greed, exploiting workers, cutting corners, bribing officials. He was rich, powerful, untouchable. And by his side was Linda, his wife, the woman I once treated like a sister. She had grown colder, sharper, her beauty tainted by arrogance. She laughed in boardrooms, her hand resting on Donald's arm, whispering advice into his ear. I could see it in her eyes. She was not just his companion. She was his partner in crime. She was the brain behind his brutality. At night, I returned to the apartment and collapsed, my fists clenched. Rage burned inside me, but Michael sat across from me, patient, calculating. "Albert, we will build this case brick by brick. We will expose him in court, in public, where no shadow can protect him. But first we need proof. Proof of fraud, of coercion, of violence. And most of all, we need witnesses. Witnesses." That word haunted me. Who would dare speak against Donald? He had money, he had men, he had influence. Fear was his armor. But then I remembered Elias's words. The river cuts stone not with force, but with persistence. I had to be the river. So I began to move quietly. By day I watched my family from afar, never revealing myself. By night I followed Donald's men, slipping through alleys, listening to conversations, collecting scraps of truth. I became a shadow in the city, invisible yet everywhere. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. I learned of bank transfers, of fake accounts, of threats made to business rivals. I discovered how he forced father to sign away the estate, beating him, starving him, breaking his will. Each detail was a dagger I stored in my heart, saving it for the day of reckoning. But the hardest blow came one evening, when I overheard Anna crying to her mother, "Mama, I dream of Papa. I dream he's alive, coming back to us. Why doesn't he come? Why doesn't he save us?" Clara's voice broke as she held her daughter, whispering, "Because he's gone, Anna. He's gone, and we must survive without him." That night I wept like I had never wept before. To see my child cry for me while I hid like a coward, it tore me apart. Yet I knew I must endure. For when I return, it cannot be as a broken man. It must be as a storm. Michael, seeing my torment, placed his hand on my shoulder. "Hold on, Albert. Your time is coming. We will gather enough. We will destroy him legally, and when the truth explodes, the world will know who the real Albert Walker is." But Elias, when I visited him again for advice, smiled and shook his head. Court is one path, but truth is many-sided. Sometimes justice is not found in the hands of law, but in the eyes of those who suffer. Ask yourself, Albert, do you want to defeat Donald? Or do you want him to feel every ounce of the pain he gave you? Those words planted a seed in me, a darker seed. For the first time, I wondered, not only about justice, but about revenge. And thus, the storm began to form. The city no longer felt like home, it felt like a battlefield, and in every battlefield, the first move decides everything. For weeks, I had stalked my brother's empire from the shadows, my eyes sharper than ever, my ears tuned to every whisper. I saw how Donald lived now, in his mansion at Pacific Heights, surrounded by luxury, guarded by men who bowed to his every command. But I also saw cracks in his fortress. For all his wealth, Donald was not wise. He trusted too easily the flattery of those who praised him, and he underestimated the silence of those who hated him. Silence, after all, was the mask of fear, and fear, once broken, becomes rage. Michael brought me papers one night. They were copies of financial statements, pulled secretly from the City Hall records. I traced the lines with my fingers: illegal property transfers, forged signatures, bribes paid to officials. Among them was Father's signature. Trembling and broken, forced onto documents that stripped us of everything. My chest tightened. I remembered that night Elias told me, "Forged ink may take a house, but truth can burn the whole city." This was my first weapon, but Michael was not done. He leaned forward and said, "Albert, there's more. He didn't just steal from you, he stole from his partners too. Silent partners, they're angry but they're too scared to face him. If we can find one willing to talk, one voice, we can begin." So I began my hunt, not for Donald, but for his victims. I visited old acquaintances under false names. Some doors slammed shut, others opened only halfway. People recognized me vaguely but shook their heads, muttering, "He's too powerful, leave it, stranger, nothing good comes from crossing Donald Trump." But one night in a quiet bar near Fisherman's Wharf, I found a man named Robert Greene, once a junior partner in my company. He drank too much, his eyes sunken, his voice bitter. I sat beside him and whispered, "Tell me what Donald did to you." He laughed at first, thinking me a fool, until I lifted my cap, showed him my eyes, the eyes of the man he thought dead. His glass slipped from his hand. "Albert, my God, you're alive." Robert told me everything. How Donald cut him, out of contracts, how he used threats to silence complaints, how Linda herself manipulated papers to erase names. Robert had nothing left, his house gone, his career ruined. He was living on scraps, waiting for a chance at revenge. And that night, I gave him that chance. "You will testify," I said. "When the time comes, your voice will be the hammer." He nodded, fear and fire mixing in his eyes. But my heart could not rest with only papers and promises. I had to strike, not to destroy, but to remind Donald that the ghost he buried was walking again. So I chose a symbol, something he loved, something that would shake him without revealing my face. Donald had a collection of vintage cars, locked in a glass showroom downtown, where he flaunted his wealth. One night, dressed in black, I slipped inside. The alarms were weak, his arrogance had made him careless. I walked among the cars, each shining under the pale light. I touched the hood of his favorite, a red 1965 Mustang, the car he boasted about in every interview, and with a steady hand, I carved 3 words into the paint with my knife: "Justice is coming." By morning, the city buzzed, reporters swarmed. The scene. Donald stormed into the showroom, his face red, his fists clenched. "Find out who did this," he roared at his men. Linda stood beside him, her lips thin, her eyes sharp. She knew. It wasn't random. Someone was sending a message. Someone who knew him well enough to strike where it hurt. But she did not yet know who. From the shadows across the street, I watched him rage, and for the first time in years, I smiled. The hunter was no longer certain of his safety. The predator had felt fear. Michael scolded me later. "That was reckless, Albert. You could have been caught." But I only shook my head. "No, Michael, it was necessary. A man like Donald, He does not fear papers. He fears shadows. He fears what he cannot see. Now he knows something is coming, and that fear will make him weak. Days passed, and I continued my secret war. I slipped into offices at night, copying files. I followed Donald's men, listening to their careless words in bars. Slowly, I pieced together not only fraud but crimes darker: smuggling, tax evasion, threats of violence against those who resisted. Each discovery was a stone added to my arsenal. Yet with each stone, my anger grew heavier. But anger was not my only companion. Longing pulled at me every day. Each night I returned near Redwood Village, watching Anna father from the shadows. I saw Anna writing in a small notebook by candlelight. I saw Clara sewing torn clothes, her fingers bleeding. I saw Father coughing alone in the cold. Sometimes I reached out my hand, almost stepping forward, almost breaking my disguise. But then I would hear Michael's voice in my head, or Elias's calm wisdom reminding me, "Not yet. Patience is your sharpest blade." And so, I sharpened it further. One evening, I made my boldest move yet. I entered my own office building, Trump, and conveners in disguise. It was a charity gala, a glittering event filled with politicians, businessmen, and the wealthy elite. I wore a mask like the others, blending into the crowd. I watched Donald boast on stage, his arm around Linda, his smile wide. He spoke of success, of honor, of legacy, words built on my blood. My jaw tightened. I wanted to tear his lies apart, right there. But instead I slipped into his private office upstairs. Inside, I found safes, files, letters. Among them, photographs of Clara and Anna, taken without their knowing, watched by his men. My blood boiled. He wasn't just keeping them away. He was surveilling them, controlling them, making sure they remained prisoners in that small village. That night, standing in his office, I swore to myself, I would not only reclaim my name, I would tear his empire down brick by brick until he had nothing left but ashes. As I left the gala, I passed Donald in the hall. For a brief moment, his eyes brushed mine. He frowned as if something in my face, something in my eyes sparked a memory. But I lowered my head, and the moment slipped away. Still, the seed was planted. Somewhere in his mind, the ghost of Albert Walker stirred. Back at the apartment, Michael asked me, "What now?" I looked out the window at the city lights and said, "Now, we begin to break his circle. His men, his allies, his wife. One by one we turn them, or we destroy them. And when the circle is broken, Donald will stand alone. That is when I strike." The silence that followed, I felt Elias's words again, carried by the wind through memory. "The mountain taught you patience, Albert, but it also taught you strength. You are not only a survivor, you are the storm." And in that moment I knew the storm had already begun. Every empire, no matter how grand, does not collapse when the walls are attacked. It collapses when the pillars inside begin to crack. Donald thought his men were loyal. He thought money bought faith, that fear bought silence, but loyalty purchased with gold is loyalty rented, not owned. And fear is fragile when a stronger fear rises against it. I began with the weakest, Link, his driver, Tony Ramirez. For 10 years, Tony drove Donald's cars, carried his secrets in silence. But I learned Tony had debts, gambling debts, hidden from his boss. One night I found him outside a casino in Oakland, his face pale, sweat dripping as collectors circled him like wolves. I stepped from the shadows, cleared his debt with cash I had saved, and looked him in the eyes. "You don't know me. You don't need to. But one day soon I will ask for a truth, a single truth, and when I do, you will give it." He nodded, fear and gratitude battling in his stare. A seed was planted. Next was Harold Stone, Donald's legal advisor. A clever man, sharp with words, ruthless with contracts. But he had a weakness. His daughter, a student at Stanford, caught in a scandal of drugs and expulsion. Donald knew, and Donald kept Harold leashed by threats. I sent Michael to speak with Harold in secret, offering protection, offering silence. At first he refused, but when Michael handed him a photo, Donald's men shadowing his daughter on campus, Harold's mask cracked. His voice trembled as he asked, "What do you want from me?" And I answered, "The truth, Harold. Just the truth." Piece by piece, the circle began to loosen. Some resisted. Others bent easily. Each night I returned with more names, more secrets. Robert Greene introduced me to old partners who still bore scars of Donald's betrayal. Some agreed to testify, some only whispered curses in the dark. But the whispers were enough. The whispers were cracks. Meanwhile, Donald grew restless. Reports piled on his desk, missing files, anonymous warnings, men too frightened to obey orders. He stormed through his office, shouting at Linda, at his guards, at anyone who dared cross his path. But Linda was not blind. She watched him unravel, and though she stood at his side, I saw the flicker in her eyes: fear, calculation, doubt. She had married power, not chaos. And chaos was all Donald now offered her. Still, I could not strike only at business. My heart burned for my family. So one night, I slipped into Redwood Village. For the first time in years, I knocked softly on the window of the small cottage where Clara slept. She stirred, opened her eyes, and for a moment froze as if seeing a ghost. Then tears spilled down her face. "Albert, is it you?" She whispered so softly, afraid even of the air. I pressed a finger to my lips, tears choking my own voice. "I'm alive, Clara, but you must not tell anyone. Not yet." She clutched, my hand trembling, begging to know everything, but I could only promise I will return, and when I do, this nightmare will end. Leaving her again was agony, but her tears gave me fire. No longer was this only about revenge, it was about home, about bringing them back to where they belonged. The next strike came faster than Donald expected. His company prepared a deal with a foreign investor, a contract worth millions. But Harold, now trembling under my shadow, slipped me a copy of the terms. With Michael's help, we leaked the deal's darkest clauses to the press. Corruption, laundering, lies. The morning headlines screamed betrayal. Politicians who once smiled beside Donald now distanced themselves. Investors pulled out. Donald's rage shook the city. He fired half his staff, cursed the media, accused rivals of conspiracy. But deep inside, he feared. For the first time, he feared the invisible hand pulling his strings. And then, I struck, his pride again. The Mustang was only the beginning. This time it was his mansion. At night, while his guards patrolled outside, I slipped in with nothing but a bucket of paint. On his white marble wall, in bold black strokes, I wrote 4 words: "The brother remembers all." By dawn, every neighbor, every reporter saw it. Donald's face turned pale when he read it. He smashed the wall with his fist, shouting, he's dead, this is a trick." But in his heart he knew. The ghost was real. The brother he buried was alive. Linda pressed him. "Donald, who is doing this? What are you hiding? From me?" He avoided her gaze, but I knew seeds of doubt now grew between them. And doubt in marriage is poison stronger than any blade. Michael warned me again. "Albert, each strike brings you closer to him, but also closer to exposure." I nodded. "Yes. But exposure is not my enemy. Fear is my weapon. And right now, fear eats Donald alive." From the mountain, Elias's voice still guided me. "You cannot kill him in rage. You must kill him in truth. Truth sharpens the blade of revenge." And so I gathered truth after truth, piling them like arrows in a quiver. But arrows are useless until they are fired. And soon, I would fire them all. I once believed betrayal was born in shadows, that it crept in from enemies waiting outside the walls. But I was wrong. Betrayal is not born in the dark. It is born at the dinner table, in the silence between husband and wife, in the doubts that slowly erode trust. And now I knew Donald's greatest weakness was not his empire, not his guards, not his greed. His greatest weakness was sitting across from him every night. Linda. Linda had once been the perfect accomplice, whispering schemes into Donald's ear, smiling while she signed papers drenched in my father's stolen blood. But time changes everything. Power that once tasted sweet had turned bitter. Chaos had replaced certainty, and the man she had married was no longer the confident, rising businessman, but a paranoid tyrant, raging at shadows. I knew from Harold, the lawyer I had turned, that Linda now asked too many questions. Why do the papers mention Albert? Why do reporters claim there were irregularities in the will? Why is half the city against us? Donald silenced her with anger, but anger cannot erase suspicion. So, I began to feed her fire. Not with lies, but with fragments of truth. A letter slipped into her purse, unsigned, containing a copy of one of my father's real wills, proving Donald had forged documents. A flash drive mailed anonymously to her office, filled with voice recordings of Donald's men boasting of what they did to me the night my car fell from the cliff. She listened to them in silence, hands shaking, tears streaming, though she told no one. Slowly, she began to avoid Donald's gaze at dinner. Her smile faded, her questions sharpened. I did not stop there. With Michael's help, I arranged chance encounters. One evening at a San Francisco charity gala, Linda received an envelope on her table. Inside was a photo, not of Donald, not of me, but of her father-in-law, beaten, broken, forced to sign papers that stole his land. On the back, a single sentence. Is this the empire you married into? Witnesses say she stared at it for hours, her wine untouched. That night she argued with Donald so loudly the neighbors heard. Donald's paranoia grew. He accused her of betrayal, of conspiring with his enemies, of questioning his authority. And Linda, who once bowed her head, now raised her voice. You promised me security, Donald. You promised me power. But all I see is fear. Who are you really fighting? His silence answered her better than any lie. Still, Linda was not innocent. She had chosen greed once. She had tasted its fruit. I knew she could not be trusted fully, but she was a wedge, and a wedge, once driven, can split the strongest stone. Meanwhile, Elias reminded me, do not confuse her doubt for loyalty, Albert. She is a player of survival. Use her, but do not love her story. His words echoed as I watched her from the shadows of her mansion, her face pale under the glow of a window lamp, her hand clutching the forged will. She was trapped in a cage of gold she once desired, and now that cage had become her prison. And then, the moment came. Through Tony, the driver, I arranged a meeting. A quiet cafe in Palo Alto, a corner seat where no one would notice. Linda arrived wrapped in a long coat, her eyes scanning the room nervously, and there I was stepping from the shadows. She froze, gasped, her hand trembling as she whispered, Albert, it's true. You're alive. I nodded, my eyes fixed on hers, not with hatred but with a calm fire. I am alive, Linda. And everything you built with Donald was built on my grave. Tell me, are you ready to watch it burn? Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to confess, but fear chained her tongue. I leaned closer, my voice steady. You don't have to fight me. You only have to let the truth breathe. Donald cannot silence both of us forever. When she left, I saw the storm raging within her, and I knew Donald's house was no longer a fortress. It was a battlefield, and his own wife was no longer standing firmly by his side. The cracks at home had begun, and cracks when pressed can bring down empires. Revenge is not only about striking enemies. Sometimes it is about planting doubt in the heart of their closest ally. And when that ally begins to wonder who the real villain is, victory is no longer a dream. It is destiny. Some battles are fought with fists, some with fire, and some with blood. But the deadliest battles are fought with paper, with signatures, with words twisted into chains. For years, Donald chained me with lies, forged papers, and stolen ink. Now it was my turn to to sharpen the same weapons against him. It began with Harold. My old friend, once laughed at by Donald as an outdated lawyer, was now my sword and shield. He brought me into his quiet office in downtown San Jose, walls lined with legal books, the air heavy with the weight of justice and time. "Albert," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If you want to win this, you cannot strike with anger, you must strike with law. And the law, though slow, can cut deeper than any knife." I nodded, because I had learned patience from Elias, the mountain sage, and now it was time to let patience turn into power. The first step was the Santa Clara County Superior Court, a place Donald thought he had bought long ago. Judges he dined with, clerks he bribed, officers he entertained. But Harold knew which doors to knock, which stones to overturn. We began, filing, quietly, carefully, petitions that reopened the case of my father's estate, questioning the forged documents Donald had used. We attached evidence, the hidden will my father had left in Harold's safekeeping, the medical report proving my father had been beaten before signing away land, the photographs of bruises that the doctor in Stanford Hospital had quietly recorded, fearing Donald's reach. Next came the corporate records where Donald had erased my name as founder. Harold pulled banking slips from Wells Fargo, emails from business associates who once warned me about Donald's greed, recordings of boardroom meetings where Donald's voice betrayed the crime. Piece by piece, the mask he wore began to tear Dot, but Donald was no fool. When he learned papers had been filed, he exploded like a cornered beast. His lawyers, sharp-suited, smooth-tongued, tried to delay, to dismiss, to bury us in motions. They argued I was dead, that the man filing petitions was an imposter, a fraud. Imagine the irony. The man who buried me now claiming I never existed. I stood in court for the first time, the gavel echoing through the chamber, my face pale but burning with fire. Gasps filled the room as I spoke. "My name is Albert Walker. You tried to bury me under lies, but here I stand, alive, and I will not be silent." The judge leaned forward, studying me with sharp eyes. Donald, sitting across, turned pale, his hands clenching the table, his eyes darting to Linda, who sat frozen, her face betraying both fear and guilt. That was the moment. The empire of lies had cracked in public. Yet this was not only about one hearing, it became a war of documents, hearings in Santa Clara, then appeals filed in California Court of Appeal, 6th District. Harold worked nights, without rest, while I traveled with him to gather witnesses. The farmer who once saw my father dragged into Donald's house. The secretary who typed the forged contracts but never dared speak. Even Tony, the driver who once worked for Donald, came forward, his conscience too heavy to carry. Each testimony was a nail in Donald's coffin. But law is not just truth. It is also theater. And Harold taught me how to perform. He made me practice my voice, steady but emotional, so that when I spoke, the courtroom listened not just to facts, but to pain. I told them how my father's trembling hands were forced onto paper, how my wife and daughter were cast away into the wilderness, how I myself was thrown from a mountain road. The silence in the chamber was heavy, judges shifting in discomfort, jurors wiping tears. And Donald, he could no longer hide his sweating brow. Outside, the media storm grew. Business tycoon faces family betrayal case. Dead brother returns from the grave. Cameras followed me, microphones thrust forward, reporters asking if revenge drove me. My answer was simple. This is not revenge, this is justice. Revenge is mine, but justice belongs to the truth. And yet, deep inside, I knew the truth. This was revenge. Every word, every paper, every hearing was a blade pointed at Donald's heart. I wanted him not only to lose wealth, but to feel the weight of humiliation, to watch the empire he stole turn into ashes in front of his eyes. Linda's silence was another weapon. She did not testify, but her absence at Donald's side screamed louder than words. The jury noticed. The judge noticed. Everyone noticed. And I knew. She was breaking from him piece by piece, even if she never openly joined me. By the time the first ruling came, Donald was already bleeding. The judge ruled in my favor, freezing half of his assets until ownership could be proven. The empire he had built on stolen blood was no longer untouchable. His men, once loyal, began to question their paychecks. His friends stopped returning calls. And I stood outside the courthouse watching him drive away in silence, his eyes hollow. Revenge is not always loud. Sometimes it is the whisper of a gavel, the silence of a crowd, the sight of a man who once ruled the city now walking alone, his shadow shrinking with every step. This was not the end, but it was the beginning of Donald's fall. If the court was the battlefield of truth, then the city was the battlefield of perception. To destroy Donald, I had to do more than prove papers. I had to burn the mask he wore before the world. I had to make his name taste like ash on the tongues of those who once praised him. The ruling of the court had shaken him, but Donald was still standing. His money, his connections, his charm, they had carried him for decades. I knew it wasn't enough to win inside the courtroom. I had to strike outside, where his empire of lies was built on social respect, business alliances, and political favors. So Harold and I began our second war, the war of reputation. We reached out to every partner Donald had cheated, every investor. He had betrayed every employee he had discarded like trash. Some were afraid, still under his shadow, but others were waiting for someone to give them courage. Slowly, one by one, they came forward. The man whose land Donald had stolen for a shopping mall in Palo Alto. The widow whose pension funds he had swallowed through fake investments. Even the young accountant from his San Jose office who revealed how Donald laundered money into shell corporations. Each story, each testimony, was another crack in his carefully painted wall. Meanwhile, the press had made me a symbol. The brother who returned. They called me a ghost, a survivor, a man of resilience. I did not crave their titles, but I used them. Every interview, every camera, every headline, I let my words slice through Donald's reputation. He was once my brother, I said, and I gave him everything. My bread, my books, my blood, and he repaid me with betrayal. If he can do this to family, imagine what he can do to strangers. The city listened, and for the first time, Donald's charm failed him. Invitations stopped arriving. The politicians, who once smiled beside him, quietly erased his name from their donor lists. The businessman who once toasted to his success now whispered doubts in country clubs. But revenge is never easy. Donald fought back, like a cornered wolf, desperate and furious. He staged charity galas, tried to paint me as a bitter old man craving attention, accused me of lying, of faking my identity. He even hired men to follow me, to scare me, to remind me that his claws were not gone. Yet the mountain had taught me not to fear shadows. Elias's words echoed in my mind. A man who shouts his power is already losing it. The strongest mountain is the one that remains silent. So I remained calm, and the more I refused to be shaken, the more the people believed me. Linda, his wife, had grown silent. She stopped appearing at his side, stopped smiling at the cameras. I knew why. She had seen the papers we had unearthed, the truth of his crimes, and though she was complicit, her guilt was cracking her from within. She did not come to me, but her absence beside Donald spoke louder than any confession, and the city noticed. "Where is Linda?" they asked. Donald's empire thrived on appearances, and now appearances were betraying him. But perhaps the sweetest moment came when I visited the very office that once bore my name, Walker Enterprises, now twisted under Donald's control. I did not go with anger. I went with patience. I spoke to the employees not as a ghost returned from death, but as the founder they once respected. I told them I had come not for vengeance, but to rebuild what was stolen. And one by one they began to shift. Whispers in the hallways, glances during meetings. Loyalty was leaving Donald like sand slipping through a fist. Soon, reports of mismanagement surfaced. Contracts failed. Investors pulled back. The mighty skyscraper he had built was no longer a fortress. It was a hollow tower ready to fall. Donald always thought betrayal was strength. But what he never understood was that loyalty, once broken, can never be bought back. The people who stood with him out of fear were now free. And fear, when it fades, becomes the sharpest knife of all. The day came when he stood before the press shouting, sweating, swearing that he was still in control, that I was lying, that the city was ungrateful, and I stood in the shadows watching him crumble. His voice cracked, his hands trembled, his mask was gone. He was no longer the confident king of California business. He was just a man drowning in the ashes of his own greed. And I smiled, not with joy, but with the calm of justice. Because this was only the beginning. The empire was crumbling, but the man himself had not yet paid the full price. That price was still waiting, and I was patient enough to collect it. For years I dreamed of this moment. The day I would know, longer watch from shadows, no longer fight him through papers, courts, or whispers, but face him as a man, as a brother, as the ghost he created. And when the day came, it was not in a courtroom, not in a press hall, but in the very house where we once grew up together. Donald had retreated to our old family mansion on the outskirts of Los Gatos, a place that once echoed with laughter, with mother's voice, with father's prayers. Now it stood like a tomb, silent, its lights dim, its windows shuttered. He thought he could hide there, away from the press, from investors, from the world that now despised him. But he could not hide from me. That night under the heavy California sky, I walked through the broken gates and into the heart of the house that was once our home. Every step echoed memories. Me carrying his school bag when he was too weak. Me giving him the larger piece of bread when our table had little. Me saving money to buy him the shirt he wanted for Christmas. And now those same steps carried me into the lion's den. I found him in Father's study, the place where we once sat on the old leather chair as children, listening to stories of honesty and legacy. He was not the man the world knew. He was pale, disheveled, his suit wrinkled, his glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. And when his eyes met mine, they widened, not with love, not with relief, but with the cold terror of seeing a ghost. "Albert," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, this isn't real. You're dead." I did not shout. I did not rush. I stood there, silent, letting my presence weigh on him. "You should know better, Donald. I'm harder to kill than your men thought." His hand shook, the glass fell, and whiskey spread across the floor like spilled blood. For a moment he looked small, like the boy I once carried, like the brother I once protected. And then the mask returned. He clenched his jaw, forced a smirk. "So you survived. Fine. But what do you want now, Albert? Money? A share of the empire? Say the word, and it's yours. You don't have to destroy me. We're blood. Those words cut deeper than knives. Blood. He spoke of blood after he had spilled mine, after he had thrown me into a grave of steel and fire. My voice broke, not with weakness, but with fury sharpened by years of silence. Blood is sacred, Donald. Blood is sacrifice. Trust. Love. Blood is giving your brother your meal, your shirt, your future. I gave you everything, and you fed on me like a parasite. You took my name, my work, my family's peace. You killed not just me, but the memory of who we were. You are not my brother. You are the disease that almost destroyed us." He staggered back, his face twisting. "You think you're righteous? You think you're a saint? You left me no choice. You were always the star, always the one people loved. I was the shadow, and I was done living in your shadow. Do you know what it feels like to always be second? To be pitied, protected, fed like a child? I wanted respect, Albert, and I got it. My way." His voice rose, his body shaking with rage. For the first time, the truth spilled from him. Not the lies he fed the world, but the rotting envy that had poisoned his heart since childhood. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "Respect cannot be stolen, Donald. It must be earned. And you never learned to earn. You only learned to take. And now everything you took is turning to dust in your hands." He lunged, grabbing me by the collar, his eyes burning with hate. I should have finished the job on that cliff. I should have made sure you never crawled back." His spit hit my face, his grip trembling not with strength but with desperation. I did not fight back. I simply looked into his eyes, the eyes of the boy I once loved, now drowned in greed. Slowly I pushed his hands away. "And that is why you've already lost, Donald. Because no matter what you do, you will always be fighting ghosts. Ghosts of your lies, your crimes, your betrayal. Even if you kill me now, you can never kill what you've become. And that is your prison." He collapsed into the chair, his body shaking, his face buried in his hands. The mighty Donald Trump, conqueror of businesses, manipulator of men, destroyer of family, now just a broken man in the ruins of his own hatred. I turned away, my heart heavy, not with triumph, but with sorrow. For I had won the battle, but I had lost the brother I once knew. He had buried himself long before he buried me. And so I left him there, in the silence of our father's study, surrounded by the ghosts of our childhood. Revenge had given me justice, but it could not give me back my brother. And perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. I still remember that cold morning when the sun was rising over the California hills, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. My heart pounded inside my chest as if it knew the weight of the day. For years I had carried the burden of betrayal, pain, and silence, but today, that silence would break. I, Albert Walker, once thought lost and buried beneath the cliffs, was finally going to reclaim my life. I stood on the very soil of San Francisco where my brother Donald now lived like a king, feasting on wealth that never belonged to him, smiling at a world that never knew the truth. He had stolen my company, my properties, my father's dignity, and almost shattered the heart of my daughter and wife. Yet what he never knew was that the mountains had given me back to myself. The wise old man of the hills, my accidental savior, had rebuilt me with herbs, discipline, and forgotten wisdom. He had told me one thing I could never forget. Justice is not only about punishing your enemies, it is about healing your soul while you strike. Those words burned in me every day as I rebuilt my memory, my strength, and my will. When I walked into the courthouse of San Francisco that morning, the world froze. The judge, the jury, the reporters, everyone turned as if a ghost had entered the room. My brother Donald, sitting in his expensive suit beside his cunning wife, looked at me and his face drained of all color. He whispered something under his breath, perhaps a curse, perhaps disbelief. For him, I had been dead for nearly 10 years. But here I was, alive, stronger, sharper, and burning with the fire of truth. My lawyer, an old friend who had once shared wine and laughter with me in my younger days, rose and spoke with a thunderous voice. He laid before the court documents, signed under duress, proving how Donald and his wife had forced my aged father to hand over his wealth. He showed financial trails of embezzlement, forged signatures, and threats. Piece by piece, the image of Donald as a respected businessman crumbled into dust. The jury gasped, reporters scribbled furiously, and my daughter, my sweet, brave daughter, held her mother's hand with tears in her eyes. She had waited all these years to see her father's name restored. And today she saw it. But revenge is not always carried out in silence. As I stood to speak, my voice shook the room. I told them how I had fed my brother when he was hungry, how I had carried his school bag, how I had given him my share of joy, clothes, and comfort. I told them how I had once thought that blood was thicker than greed. And then, with the deepest sorrow, I told them how wrong I was. Donald lowered his eyes, perhaps for the first time realizing the depth of his betrayal. His wife looked at me with defiance, but even she could not hide the tremor in her hands. When the judge declared Donald guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder, the court erupted. But inside me, there was no joy, only silence. Justice had been served, but the scars of betrayal could never truly heal. That night, I returned to the small house by the mountains where the old man still lived. He greeted me with the same calm smile, as though he had known all along this day would come. "You have won your battle," he said, "but do not let hate rule you now. A heart, poisoned by hatred, is never free. His words cut through me. For years I had dreamed of this moment. My brother ruined, my honor restored. But now, standing at the edge of victory, I realized something unexpected. Revenge was not the end. It was only the beginning of healing. I turned my eyes toward my daughter, who hugged me tighter than she ever had, whispering that she was proud. In that moment, I understood that my true victory was not in seeing Donald fall. It was in standing tall again, with my family by my side, unbroken, unbowed. So, here I am, telling you this story not as a broken man, not as a victim, but as a survivor. My name is Albert Walker, and my life was stolen, twisted, and buried under betrayal. Yet I rose again, carved by pain, sharpened by time, and guided by the wisdom of those who still believe in goodness. If you ever face the cruelty of betrayal, remember this: it may break your body, it may steal your years, but it can never take away your will, unless you let it. Stand, fight, heal. That is the only way forward. And as for me, I will spend the rest of my days not chasing revenge, but protecting the fragile love that I almost lost. Because in the end, buried love can rise again, and burning hate will eventually turn to ashes.